Hey, wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to episode 48 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. If you watch previous episodes, we kind of readjusted the numbering a little bit because we've been interviewing so many people recently. I wanted to make sure that you're getting more and more perspectives as we transition to this world of Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, and central bank digital currencies. If this is your first episode of Bitcoin Hard Talk, welcome. We have got a lot to cover today. We cover everything that happened this week in Bitcoin, in macro, and geopolitics. It's hard talk about the hardest form of money. And if we're meeting for the first time, my name is Simon Dixon. I spent the last 2 decades obsessing over the topic of Bitcoin investing and money. And I follow the money to make sure that you are ahead of all the different trends. So without further ado, we're going to jump straight in. In the first section, we'll be covering everything that happened this week in Bitcoin. And then we're going to be going over to the macro side. And then we're going to be going over to the geopolitical side. Just before we start, make sure that you check out after this episode or when you get a chance, my interview with Saifedean Moose, where we covered everything on understanding and following the money with war, the Palestinian conflict that we're experiencing. In fact, I'd call it a genocide, and how that relates to Bitcoin and following the money. And so, if we are going down this path, we are going to travel it together. But I'd like to get you ahead by understanding the trends so that you don't have to rely upon the traditional media for your news, because it will take you down the path that the channel that is paying for it wants to take you down. So, what happened this week? So, firstly, again, every single week now, the amount of drama that happens every single week, just this week alone, if you are on my newsletter at simondixon.com, you would have known that we had a UK civil unrest, a complete civil unrest across different cities of the UK. On Monday, we had a US market, Black Monday, that was across the Taiwan market, the Japanese market, and the US market. We also had the reversal of the Japanese carry trade and collapse. We're going to be covering all about that in the macro section. We had massive escalations in the Middle Eastern region, and that's going to affect us all. So, escalations. And we even had the overthrow of a government in Bangladesh and a new plant. We're going to be following the money to understand why are all these things happening and how does it impact us as we transition to this world of Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, and central bank digital currencies. So, without further ado, let's start with the first segment where we go through everything to do with Bitcoin. So, we started the weekend where and we moved into Monday, $1 billion of Bitcoin liquidated and crypto market trades happened within the first 24 hours of Black Monday. I'm going to be going through that, but the real story here is, why is there so much leverage in the system? Allow the traders to leverage each other, get liquidated. This is how you end up with no Bitcoin, because you're speculating and playing the game of the fiat currency proof of weapons network. You're taking the hardest, soundest money the world has ever seen, Bitcoin, and you're turning it into a paper version of Bitcoin, which is a liability to the exchange, which would make you an unsecured creditor if it went wrong. And then you're levering it up in the fiat currency proof of weapons network in order to try and end up with more money. Where if you get on the wrong side of one of these trades, you end up with no Bitcoin and just a claim in a bankruptcy and a bunch of fiat currency that makes you broke, wondering why you ever messed with that shit in the first place. 300,000 investors were liquidated on Black Monday out of their Bitcoin and crypto worth $1 billion. We don't like messing around with Bitcoin. Bitcoin deserves more respect. It gave us the ability to own our own money. It gave us the ability to transact peer to peer with anyone in the world. And it gave us the ability to combat and resist the central banks that are taking us down this war that is going to end up to the death and destruction of so many. And hopefully you make it out on the other side, because you were able to resist with Bitcoin once once this goes down the route that our leaders are taking us to, because our countries have been occupied by central banks in deals with governments, with all sorts of shenanigans happening in order to overthrow governments and push forward agendas that none of us, when we understand following the money, would want to be a part of it. So the moral of the story is don't leverage. If you got wrecked from your Bitcoin, learn the lesson, rebuild, own more Bitcoin every single month. Head over to simondixon.com, sign up to the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal for free, and I'll make sure that you get better habits so that you can be more prepared rather than messing around with fiat currency leverage anyway. So what happened after that? Well, we know the diamond hands. It recovered within 1 week anyway. We're almost back. We're almost back to where we started before Black Monday. It is only down approximately 6% from last week, even though we had a major crash in between. This was the test of the ETF investors. This was the test of the new people into this cycle. Are you a victim of FUD and FOMO? Or do you understand that there are only ever going to be 21 million Bitcoin? And or so many of them, maybe 4 million of them or more, have been lost. And there is a race around the world by individuals, companies, and sovereign states, and even central banks to own those Bitcoin. And you disrespect it by messing around with it. Make sure that you understand that you are in a race to accumulate the world's rarest asset that cannot be changed by any government, any party, any individual, and it is digital hard sound money. So this week, if you were got on the right side of this, you could have bought at under $50,000 because of Black Monday. And that creates an incredible opportunity to get Bitcoin on sales if you are a Bitcoin thinker. Value your wealth in Bitcoin, not fiat currency, and you won't be at the mercy of the proof of weapons network, suffering from FUD and FOMO by valuing your wealth in Bitcoin. Now, Ethereum, the second largest cryptocurrency, it had a much bigger correction than Bitcoin. Why? Well, at the same time, we had emergency liquidations from the Jump Crypto hedge fund. We don't know what's going on there. Maybe, and just maybe, I don't have any information on this, but we shall find out very shortly in the months ahead. Maybe they borrowed the money at 0% from the Bank of Japan Ponzi scheme in order to lever up and make leverage trade that meant they had to do emergency liquidations and crash the Ethereum market even further. Or maybe because they were dealing with that, they also had an SEC investigation because it doesn't have full commodity-like properties like Bitcoin, and therefore it is a more levered play. And maybe they have to settle with the SEC. We don't know. There was more settlement action this week. I don't think that's what's happened, but I think we're going to find out. But they had to liquidate a serious amount of Ethereum, and we shall find out. At the same time, remember, Grayscale, they launched the Ethereum ETF, and these are one-time issues. And so the Grayscale ETF means they charge us 2.5% fee when everyone else was charging a reasonable fee. So there's all these inflows and outflows you need to track around the Grayscale Ethereum ETF. At the same time, those people that play fake central banker, remember Do Kwon from the Terraform Labs, the Terra Luna USD, which pretended it was decentralized when was just really playing the role of central banker and using Bitcoin as its collateral, and created a systemic risk event for those that were messing around with this pretend decentralized VC-funded Ponzi scheme. Well, Do Kwon is now going to be extradited to South Korea rather than America. And I hear that the prisons in South Korea are a lot less friendly than America. We shall see. But that was the update on that case when you play central banker and mess around. At the same time, the SEC made a settlement with the company Ripple Labs. Full disclosure, years ago, through Bank to the Future, we funded much of the Bitcoin companies, but we also did a funding round on Bank to the Future. Many of our investors and myself ended up shareholders in Ripple. It owns a bunch of XRP. I've never purchased XRP in my life. However, I'm still a shareholder in the Ripple Labs company through Bank to the Future, waiting for it to exit. Way more interested in the Bitcoin companies. Now, however, Ripple took on the FEC, and that has implications on the market. Instead of being fined the $2 billion, it has been fined $125 million instead. And the rulings have been made. Basically, the company, Ripple Labs, has about 60% of the XRP supply on its company balance sheet. And its main source of revenue is selling XRP tokens, which is why it's such a raw deal for those that own XRP, because it gets dumped and increases the supply. But Ripple Labs sold about $1.3 billion of its XRP through selling it to investors. And the SEC said that this was an unregistered security that you were selling, and therefore you needed to be registered in order to sell it. So what was the outcome of the court case? The outcome of the court case was that Ripple, the company, was selling those XRP tokens, what they call institutional sales, then this violated securities laws. So therefore, selling tokens, if it is set up in a certain way by a company that can, that sells to other, is in this case, case law, considered a security. However, they said that programmable cells did not meet the definition of a security. What does that mean? It means that if people bought them on an exchange through a company like Coinbase or any other company that offers those XRP tokens on a programmatic exchange where they don't know who the buyers and sellers are, then it is not a security. This has implication for the Coinbase case. Full disclosure, I was a shareholder in Coinbase through Bank to the Future. We did an early funding round. Then it went public. And we make a market in Bank to the Future for those that want to buy public shares like Coinbase as well. And I am a shareholder in Coinbase as a result of that. But that means that they probably are not trading in securities. They actually have a securities license, but there's no clarity in the US. So they're waiting for clarity. And the SEC decided that it was time to grab the money rather than putting together clear regulations. And this has now become a political issue. And we are finding out what is the policy of crypto from both the Republicans and the Democrats in the US. And the crypto vote is deciding where it's going to go. It may care about other issues more. But we are testing the politicians, which is why Trump came to Bitcoin 2024 and took the policies of RFK. And if you haven't watched those previous episodes of Bitcoin Hard Talk, I dug deep into all of what Trump said, all of what RFK said, and all of what, there was nothing to analyze with Harris because she ain't said shit. So we don't know what's happening there. So I wasn't able to analyze it, even though she said she was going to come to Bitcoin 2024, but probably realized it was going to be an embarrassment. And so therefore pulled out and defensively had to contact all the crypto companies saying, we are doing a crypto reset. We do care about you. And yes, under the Biden administration, we have been really awful to your industry. And we allowed these scammers like Alex Majinsky and SBF to commit mass fraud out of many people's life savings. SBF was the only person that got a meeting with the SEC because they used client money in order to bribe politicians and get those meetings. We know how the system works. Okay, well, anyway, Ripple got they were given a future injunction from violating securities laws. And we don't really know what those securities laws are yet. Under the Trump administration, the Republicans have said, we will chuck out Gary Gensler and fire him. We will get rid of the Elizabeth Warren cronies. And we will go to a movement of putting this probably under the CFTC, have a virtual asset service provider regime. So rather than having these fraudsters like FTX defraud people, we can have regulations that is suitable and proportionate to support the industry. We shall see whether the game theory plays out. Will the Democrats come up with a more sensible approach? Well, it has now become a political issue. And if you get a vote and you are American, make sure you do the following: tell Kamala Harris and the Democrats that you are in charge right now. And if Biden can wake up and say that he's not actually, it's not Netanyahu that's running America right now, then maybe Biden can actually implement some of these policies because he is still in charge. Don't talk about it, do it, because the Republicans can only talk about it because they can't do it unless they win. Use this moment to leverage the game theory while all the other countries and America saying, we want to mine all the Bitcoin, we want to make America great again, we want to drain the swamp. Well, make sure that they do actually do these things because it impacts us all. And we don't get a vote because we're not American. But what you do will lead to foreign policies that kill our children. And so, therefore, please make sure that your country is supporting Bitcoin, because if you listen to the Saifedean Ammous interview, you'll realize that to stop killing our children, we need to support Bitcoin and drain the proof of weapons network that is funding all of these wars and atrocities that we'll be covering in the next section. We also had some more announcements in the Bitcoin side from FTX. So remember what I said in the beginning, we had all these leveraged liquidations. So when you put your money at an exchange, you swap your real Bitcoin for fake Bitcoin, and then you lever it up where you can end up losing all your Bitcoin. And if the company goes bust like FTX, you end up a unsecured creditor trying to fight a bankruptcy process, just like some of the very small percentage of my net worth that I put on the Celsius Ponzi scheme and ended up having to fight 2 years. And now the whole thing has started again because they took all of those assets, gave it to another bunch of fraudsters, but through the Chapter 11 complete corrupt process. And now we still got to do some activist action. So take from my experience, you do not want to be involved in any of these things. But good news, FTX creditors, FTX settled with the CFTC. And rather than the CFTC, the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission, doing what the Securities and Exchange Commission did, which is just stealing the money from victims and not giving it to victims, they decided that they're going to take $12 billion from the FTX estate and make sure that it goes to creditors. So they settled with FTX, and now that's all going to go to victims. So the CFTC, the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission, so far has proven to be a better actor at giving investor protections, not going through this crazy do the crime, pay the fine, and then the regulator keeps the money. And so therefore, we do want that to be the industry. And it looks like so far that the Republicans are going to put the crypto industry under the CFTC, and the Democrats want to continue giving more power to the SEC that has proven to be a bad actor. There is one saving grace. Trump did hire Hester Pierce, who gets it. And if they ended up in charge with the SEC, maybe they would do a better policy. We will keep tracking, and I will give you the updates every week in Bitcoin Hard Talk. The SEC is now fighting back against Coinbase because Coinbase put a reverse suit, if that's the right word. Sorry if I'm using the incorrect legal terminology. But Coinbase asked for an information request fighting the SEC, saying, we think that you're a bad actor and you're making this ambiguous on purpose. And Coinbase requested information from the SEC around how they classify what is a security and isn't. And now the SEC is countersuing because they don't want to provide that transparency. And we will continue to see whether the SEC is a good actor or a bad actor, and whether there's going to be mass reform in order to change from that do the crime, which hurts people, and pay the fine, which helps the SEC. Okay. There was also an interesting case with the Ethereum Foundation and the SEC as well. And it was determined that block validators, which are validating ETH transaction, one of the strategies I use on Bank to the Future is in my investment portfolio, which is different to the vast majority of my savings in Bitcoin. I make certain investments to try and end up with more Bitcoin, but I stake ETH in order to convert the stake into Bitcoin through Bank to the Future. But one interesting thing is because ETH is a proof of stake rather than proof of work, it means if you own ETH, you have control in the governance. And the SEC decided to use that, or actually the Fed in this case, to say that those that are validating transactions need to enforce the policy of sanctions. And so when the SEC, or sorry, I forget the name of the four-letter agency that comes after, is to do with OFAC, that comes after the sanctions enforcement. They said if you're validating transactions, you're responsible for them. And so they came after Tornado Cash, which is software. And this is a real violation of property law within the UK, First Amendment, freedom. All of these will be fought for in the future as technology is being weaponized in certain ways across America. This is a really important time. But Tornado Cash, which was software that obfuscated Ethereum transactions that ended up being used by players that were, that were using it in violation of US sanctions, they wanted to hold the validators responsible. And they said that most validators are now cooperating in that process and have blocked Tornado Cash transactions, which is a interesting development that we must watch. And in Bitcoin 2024, Edward Snowden was warning against these certain things. I will keep you up to date as always every week on Bitcoin Hard Talk, so you can see whether we're getting these slow removal of the ability to own your own Bitcoin through other more centralized networks like Ethereum. Okay, if you're enjoying this content so far, do me a favor. Please do repost it. Please do share it. Please do hit that like button. Much of what I say, many 3-4 letter agencies don't like it. So we rely upon you sharing, because YouTube does not give me any love or rank any of this stuff, because we don't bow down to the proof of weapons network. And I am 100% committed to telling you the truth. So anyway, it was the Fed that came after the majority and said that the majority of validators have now complied. This is interesting because you start looking at stable coins. As more stable coins go onto Ethereum, we could end up with Ethereum being a new form of Federal Reserve in the future as more and more stable coins do that. We will watch those trends. I will give you the stats today as we start going through this intersection between stable coins and macro policy. At the same time, there was another scam and rug pull, and they tried to connect it to Donald Trump. And to be honest, I listened to one of the spaces where the person that was involved in this rug pull said that it was actually connected to Donald Trump's son. And I do think there were some shenanigans as well. So, look, I don't mess around with NFTs or any of these stupid things, but there is a token, and do not take this as something you should look at. I don't touch it. My strategy, I prefer to invest in the equity of exchanges so that I don't have to mess around with all of these 22,000 crazy things. But there was a token called DJT, which was connected with Donald Trump's son, and it crashed 90% this week. Interestingly, Donald Trump's other son came out and said, "We love crypto. We got something coming." So after going to Bitcoin 2024, Donald Trump launched Bitcoin sneakers and trainers. They all sold out, and then they all started being sold on eBay as well. But they're also getting ready for a shitcoin launch. So they're probably doing that. So is this really a Bitcoin policy, or is it a crypto policy? Are we going to watch any kind of Republican, Democrat, left, right dynamics in the crypto shitcoin market versus the Bitcoin market? I'll keep you all up to date every single week. But essentially, the developer between the DJT token NFT rug pulled the entire thing in a minute. It was linked to the developers that had 2 million coins, and those tokens were all sold 2% of the supply in one go, crashing the price by 90% in what is otherwise known in the crypto industry as a scam rug pull. There is a person in the crypto industry, sorry if I'm saying this wrong, Martin, sorry, sorry if I'm butchering the names. That's my most famous thing. You can let me know in the comments section below. But Martin Scarelli, he was involved. He came out of prison after being involved in certain financial crimes. But he was actually on a space with Mario where he was going under trial by Twitter X Spaces, just like we did with SBF. He came on before the actual trial. He came onto the trial by X Spaces, where we got him to admit to his crimes on X Spaces. Well, we did the same with Martin Shkreli, and he was claiming that he got rug pulled by Barron Trump, Trump's son. Barron Trump has not admitted to any kind of connection to this. From the evidence that I've seen, I actually believe Martin in this case, but we shall watch it. It was a rug pull, and the Trump administration are trying to distance themselves as the other sons of Donald Trump are looking to launch NFTs and crypto scams. So we shall see where this goes and what the future of regulations is, because there needs to be types of regulations that can come in by having a clear virtual asset service provider regime that likely sits under the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission. And we shall see where it all goes. But they successfully carried out a rug pull, and you decide what the truth may be. It is probably going to lead to another case and probably potential prison sentences and distancing from the Trump administration from that as well. What else have we got? Okay, there was a settlement. Remember, when you put your coins on these exchanges, if they don't set it up as custodians. So, for example, at Bank to the Future, when you buy your Bitcoin through Bank to the Future, we give you the ability to withdraw it into cold storage. We train you on how to do that. But if you end up leaving with us, we segregate it into custody under a regulated virtual asset service provider, where that has to be segregated from our funds and it's illegal for us to touch them. Well, we saw that roll out in different bankruptcy cases. In the ones that don't do those segregation, you ended up, all that money is commingled. But we saw the settlement of another case, which is Genesis. Genesis is now distributing approximately $4 billion of Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Solana and stablecoins to its creditors. And so that case was, they went into bankruptcy in January 2023. We covered it throughout Bitcoin Hard Talk throughout the time. But on average, people are getting 64% back because they were investing it. It turned into a security at that time, and they weren't disclosing the risks. Those risks all go wrong. They invested in many of the hedge funds, pump and dump Ponzi schemes, like that were probably borrowing at 0% from Japan, levering it up through funds like Three Arrows Capital. And then they invested in Do Kwon's fake Ponzi schemes and lent money to Celsius creditors, and all those things. And the whole thing blew up, and we had the deleveraging process. Now they end up with 64% of their crypto back on average. Learn the lessons of this. So basically, if you had Bitcoin on Genesis, you're going to get 51% of your Bitcoin back, or 51% back. I didn't look into the bankruptcy, whether this is dollarized claims or crypto to crypto, but here's what I'm assuming. Because they had it in custody, it means that the property was yours, and therefore you get a different type of percentage back depending on what asset they lost. Because Ethereum creditors are getting 65% of their ETH back, and Solana creditors are getting 29%. If you had stable coins or dollars, you're getting 100% back. And they are setting up a $70 million fund in order to sue the parent company, Digital Currency Group. So there may be some more systemic stuff, because Digital Currency Group is the parent company, and they have all sorts of different services as well. So there is still more things that we will need to, and they are the one that is charging 2.5% through Grayscale, their subsidiary, on the ETH ETF when it's much cheaper. So pick your ETFs wisely, and ideally pick custodians that can then take you into cold storage. If you want to go on that journey together, then make sure you are a member of the free Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal on simondixon.com. And we can make sure that you're educated and you share this journey, because there are so many pitfalls even though this is one of the most life-changing technologies. As the proof of weapons network takes us through these atrocities, you need to understand how to get there. And I'd love to help you with that if you become a member at simondixon.com. So the largest creditors were Gemini as well, and Van Eyck. So remember, Van Eyck is one of the ETF providers, and Van Eyck is also managing the illiquid assets of Celsius. And that is about to pay out if you are a Celsius creditor. I wrote a blog post recently. Head over to simondixon.com, click on the blog, and I gave you all the important updates. Just FYI, if you are also a Celsius creditor, there was some letters that were submitted to the court. There is the people that took over the public company that is managing our mining assets is, of course, a scammy board. It's in chaos at the moment, and we're going to need to do some shareholder activism in order to bring it to the attention of the judge so that we can just get what we lobbied for in the first place, which is sell the assets, buy Bitcoin, and take out the corrupt board that tried to get themselves good salaries and use the lawyers in order to spend $350 million of money legally, just like the Majinsky scammer in the first place. Triple scam by Majinsky, scammed by the lawyers and the Chapter 11 process, and now scammed by the company that put in a corrupt board because the lawyers was looking after their buddies and the UCC was more concerned about their bonus in a public company, even though they had zero experience in order to be able to do that. I will not go too deep into that, but look out for that and make sure you are on simondixon.com on the newsletter. If you are tagged as a creditor, I'll make sure you get those as well, those updates as well. But we are still watching whether the Biden administration, under the new candidate that is running to take over or be the new president at the moment, Kamala Harris, they sent 30,000 Bitcoin to Coinbase, and we don't know whether they sold or whether they're going to be using it as a strategic reserve asset. Demand transparency in this election process while we can. Find out whether they're going to hold it, whether they're going to use it as a strategic reserve asset for the US, and they can tell you and implement it under the Biden administration rather than having to just listen to Trump, who said what they're going to do. We do not have any announcement yet on whenever any of those coins have been sold in the dump or not. But we did get a video that came out from Trump, and Trump obviously always talks about what he's going to do, so we need to hold him to account. But he released a video sharing how Bitcoin could actually pay off the $36 trillion of debt. Now, anyone that understands how the fiat currency Ponzi scheme works, they know that that is ridiculous because paying off the national debt would drive the economy into a depression, and Trump would be assassinated for draining the swamp for real, fighting the lobby groups that keep it alive, which Trump is paid by in order to keep his campaign alive, and the central bank would be drained. But instead, Trump started saying that he would like some reforms there. So rather than supporting Thomas Massie, that after reading Saifedean Ammous's Bitcoin Standards said he's introduced a end the Fed bill, Trump said he wants to be more involved in the Federal Reserve. And we do have to ask that question. And what is Kamala Harris's policy on this? Is she going to do that crypto reset? Does she understand, or does she have the right advisory groups in order to understand this? Because America is moving closer and closer and closer to having the entire national debt, a massive chunk, almost $10 trillion on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, which is a private company. We'll dig a bit more into that in the macro section. So what else did we have in Bitcoin this week as well? Well, Morgan Stanley came out and they had said that they are now opening up 15,000 accounts and 15,000 advisors to start pitching the Bitcoin ETF to their customers. So we have all these pensioners which are exposed to the demographic issue of all the countries in the world. Remember, after World War II, everyone started having babies when we stopped killing each other. They're all retiring right now. And the pension crisis is a real crisis because they're not collecting enough tax in order to pay all those liabilities. And we have major demographic issue because people aren't having enough babies anymore. And so that is either solved by migration or creating robots that can do all the work in the future through artificial intelligence and robotics. And those policies are right in the front line right now. So, how is the US going to solve its demographic issue without using its main strategic advantage that US and UK has, which is that they attract migrants? Now, obviously, that becomes a major issue, which we'll cover in the geopolitical section, which is causing civil unrest at the moment. But those demographic issues do need to be solved. And that is a major part of the pension crisis. But if you have a pension, and it is with Morgan Stanley, protect yourself with the Bitcoin ETF. It is, if you are structured correctly, a way of deferring tax liabilities, not tax advice, and being able to get exposure to Bitcoin through your pension so you are not on the wrong side of this demographic issue and pension crisis through the wars that were created in these proof of weapons network. And if we escalate those wars further, more and more humans are going to die at the same time. And hopefully you can survive by having Bitcoin and being able to bring out your humanity while we fight our governments and the forces that are driving us into war at the moment. So speaking of war at the moment, there is a country which is in war against a NATO expansion, which is Ukraine, and Ukrainians and Russians are dying because America wants to pump the proof of weapons network, get more and more funding into the military industrial complex by expanding NATO, which expands the borders, which is in direct violation of the agreements that ended the Cold War. And so now Putin has signed into law that he is recognizing cryptocurrency and Bitcoin mining. And obviously, Russia has been mining Bitcoin. Why wouldn't you? And obviously, China has, and obviously, Iran has as well, because we need the Bitcoin miners to be politically neutral. And therefore, those countries strategically mining Bitcoin is a good thing, as much of the electricity goes towards sovereigns and people start to compete. And therefore, you cannot take down Bitcoin by bombing one centralized location. Like there is, if there is a lot of Bitcoin mining in America, bad for Bitcoin. So make sure you understand that when we're putting together these policies. But fortunately, Bitcoin is the freest market ever, and it adjusts to these trends. And now Russia, in a FOMO, when Trump said we need to mine all Bitcoins in America, has decided that now is the time to legalize it, which is ahead of their resistance movement against the financial weapons of mass destruction of the sanctions, because they held some of their assets in dollars. That has led to the BRICS corridor creating ways of hedging themselves against the exposure to dollars. And obviously, Bitcoin is a strategically important part of being able to keep all these countries into check. And so they legalize the mining industry. At the same time, we have a fight of full reserve banking versus fractional reserve banking. So the Federal Reserve and the central bankers, from the work of the Bank of England, they designed the system where they could control and end up with lending money to governments so they could fund wars. And they end up with trillions of dollars of government debt on their balance sheet, and making sure that they're the largest lender to governments so that they can then put a kickback to the creators of digital currency, which is banks. They create digital currency every time they issue a loan, and they take over the issuance of sovereign of countries and currencies through digital currency. And then that creates inflation through debt slavery and the slow movement of capitalist countries to socialist countries to communism through central bank digital currencies in the end. Now, because those banks are exposed, you end up with full reserve banking being a solution and a resistance movement. Now, technology did it, what we tried to do back in 2011 when the Bank of England said, no, Bank to the Future, you cannot create a full reserve bank. And we ended up pivoting to supporting the Bitcoin industry. And then Bitcoin created technology that allowed you to send stable coins, digital dollars, as easy as sending an email, but backed by debt to the US government. And so that takes out the bank from the middle because the government wants to issue more debt. The stable coin says, you put some dollars with us, we'll buy it. And then they take the money that the government's willing to pay that backs those stable coins and they end up buying Bitcoin. So this is a speculative attack on the dollar, but it is more attack on the banking system, which drives everything to a full reserve banking model. And the government loves it because now Tether is the 18th largest lender to the US government, and we get full reserve banking rather than fractional reserve banking. In fact, Tether has lent more to the US government now through the stable coins than the governments of Germany and the governments of Australia. So when you look at who owns all the debt of the Federal Reserve Ponzi scheme and the debt-based monetary system that is created through private banks issuing loans that requires everyone to go deeper into debt, that causes inflation, that causes more wealth inequality, that causes increased taxes, that causes the more all the issues that we experience in a debt slavery that eventually ends to the destruction of a fiat currency and a return to hard money. But normally it creates civil unrest on the way that then leads to external wars, as Ray Dalio very eloquently pointed out in his videos as well and his books. But now the Fed is the largest holder of treasuries. So we're approaching approximately $10 trillion of those that debt held on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. Now, remember, the shareholders of the Federal Reserve, as they occupied America when presidents used to fight against the central banks, and in 1913 they managed to get it in place. But the shareholders of the Federal Reserve, they receive a 6% annual dividend from being shareholders. And interestingly, due to very good timing, Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway ended up selling much of their Apple stock and now has become, in a particular type of treasury, a larger holder of treasuries than the Federal Reserve for some of those different dated ones. I can't remember exactly which ones, but now Berkshire Hathaway got right ahead of Black Monday and ended up with $227 billion of cash, so it can buy up assets on the cheap as markets correct. But we end up in a Federal Reserve-led market, which is causing all the issues that we have today. And of course, they already launched the pilot of their central bank digital currency called Fed Now. Even though politicians are saying we'll make CBDCs illegal, you already have one. It's called Fed Now. So that then brings us over to the macro section. So this segues nicely. So Tether is the 18th largest lender to the US government. But who is the largest outside the Fed in terms of foreign countries? Well, it's Japan, because the Bank of Japan, after World War II, created a Ponzi scheme with the Federal Reserve in order to create a stock market bubble that destroyed the wealth and ends up with lots of wealth inequality and a addiction on debt, where you have inflation systemically part of the system. Japan is the largest lender to the US government. The second largest foreign lender is China. Well, so with Japan, we saw what happens when they decide that they need to reverse some of that trade. We're going to go through that in the Black Monday section and the macro section. But just for now, note that Japan has to unwind that Ponzi scheme, which is what caused the market crash. And if they increase rates in order to control their inflation, the whole system ends up in a Black Monday. Well, the second lender is China. And China is unwinding that because they're scared of sanctions in the trade war. And whoever is next in charge, if they start introducing many of these anti-free market tariffs and trades, then that is an act of aggression towards China, and China will further unwind. And they know what happened to the US banking system when the Fed has to emergency increase rates. They end up blowing up banking. These are all real things. Who's the third largest lender? Well, it's the UK. And if you haven't noticed right now, the UK is completely broke thanks to the Bank of England. It has no industry left, and wealth inequality has driven us into what is the looks and the beginning of a civil war, because we start, rather than blaming the Bank of England, we start blaming the 30,000 illegal immigrants, even though it is a tiny number relative to the $66 million population and the open borders policy that is happening at the US right now. And these are covert operations in order to drive us into war and justify the wars of the proof of weapons network. Because remember, governments are not in charge, the central banks are. And then you have money outside the system, which has intelligence agencies that do non government endorsed actions. And they're the ones that are really in driving all of these different covert operations. And it's only the government underneath. They pick which presidents and prime ministers is next, and they decide which governments to topple and destabilize through their covert regime change operations, that then leads to them implanting the person that they want so that they can get IMF loans, export the dollar around the world, and roll over the debt-based Ponzi schemes through global central banks, as we always talk about in Bitcoin Hard Talk. So remember, they need central bank digital currencies and they need stable coins, because the banking scheme is a debt-based Ponzi scheme. And why not just say, rather than trickle off everything to the private banks that benefit from the creation of digital dollars every time they issue a loan, why not just put all of that on the central bank's balance sheet, issue a central bank digital currency? And even Trump came out and said, we need the president to have more oversight and a decision on whether they lower rates. That is a movement towards a combination of Treasury and central bank into modern monetary theory, which I talked about as the inevitable, predictable, and guaranteed result in 2011 in my book, Bank to the Future, Protect Your Future Before Governments Go Bust, where you end up with money going back to Treasury to unwind the debt-based Ponzi scheme. And they continue to keep the debt-based Ponzi scheme through a central bank digital currency for as long as they can. If you'd like a free copy of my book, you can get a free digital download of it by becoming a free member of the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. Okay, so that really segues us into the macro situation. And remember, in previous episodes of Bitcoin Hard Talk, I said all eyes on Japan and the Japanese yen, because we got the indication that there was a massive problem with devaluations of the Japanese yen and the Korean won pair, and the impact that that has on the US dollar, because there is this thing called a carry trade. And we saw the unwinding and reversal of that policy, which was a policy created by the Bank of Japan in order to create rampant inflation and devaluation of their currency, which leads to more and more wealth inequality, and to create more and more loans to government, which created the largest welfare state based upon 230% debt to GDP. And you can see where America's going by having a similar policy, where every time they raise rates, it breaks things and everyone begs those rates to go back down again so that they can lend more money to the government, pump their stock market, create more inflation, create more wealth inequality. Well, this was, we've seen previously that when the Bank of Japan, whenever they raise rates, it leads to them needing to control their inflation policy, but they can't do it because it breaks things. And so, because they have to have 0% interest on their money, this created this Ponzi scheme called the cash and carry trade that is currently being unwound, and we don't know the effects of it yet. This is a 30-year policy of the Bank of Japan allowing people to borrow Japanese yen at 0% interest. We have had this trade that exists from 1995 to today, and we don't know the size of it. Some estimates say that it is $4 trillion. Others say it's $20 trillion. Others say it's less than that. And others, like JP Morgan, said almost 75% of it was unwound this week. But who borrowed it and who needed to sell assets en masse in order to repay that 0% loan, because what were they doing? Well, they were borrowing at 0% from the Bank of Japan for free. And then they were using financial weapons and mass destructions and derivatives in order to hedge their exposure to the currency risk, which means that somebody else is on the other side of that. And there is $1 quadrillion of derivatives contracts out there through credit default swaps and all sorts of swap agreements between currency exposures. And so you have all these hedge funds that are taking money from your pension, where a percentage of it is able to go, or these insurance funds, which collects money through insurance contracts or endowment funds at colleges that are laundering money in order to hide the intelligence agencies that are investing in different stocks like the war machine, that then reinvest that into controlling Congress through lobby groups and pretending that we live in democracies that need to be exported around the world. Well, anyway, they use that money that they borrow at 0% and they invest in NASDAQ stocks. They invest in lending to the US government. And now those trades need to be unwound. And so rather than the US having those trades unwound, they just simply create a new financial weapon of mass destruction. And they basically print off some more money in order to allow that trade to unwind. Well, what happens? You reduce your currency exposure. And then if the Bank of Japan says, now you need to pay 0.25% because we got rampant inflation, the whole thing blows up because we don't know what those contracts look like. We don't know what hedge funds are exposed. We don't know what banks invested in those hedge funds. We don't know what endowment funds, what pension funds invested in. And we have this crazy situation where we don't know whether this is going to lead to a credit crisis or not. Maybe it just blows up a few hedge funds. Fine, we don't care about that. But we shall see in the weeks ahead who got on the wrong side, just like we saw with Silicon Valley Bank when they were on the wrong side of this because they weren't hedging those different types of exposure. And so the Bank of Japan decided inflation's too bad. We need to increase our rates to approximately 0.24%. So they just put them up 0.25%. And we had Black Friday. This created a crash in the markets. Now, what was interesting is when you need to unwind those trends, remember we had Jump Crypto that needed to emergency unwind Ethereum. They need to go to the market that is open over the weekend 24/7. And over the weekend, we saw a big crash in the Bitcoin market. Beautiful. We love Bitcoin crashes because we value our wealth in Bitcoin. If you have watched Bitcoin Hard Talk over the years, and we love it when we can buy more Bitcoin with our fiat currency as a result of these Ponzi scheme that look to sell the only asset that they could liquidate over the weekend. And suddenly we knew that because it was the weekend, markets were closed, Bitcoin's open. We got a massive correction in the Bitcoin market, which became a leading indicator that there was going to be issues in the stock markets on Monday. We saw the last time Japan did this, they end up having crashes and they leads to recessions after these crashes. We saw them try to do this in 2001 when we had a dot-com boom and bust. That's when my father lost all of his money and came to me and said, Simon, what happened to my money? And then fortunately, I got obsessed with money, ended up discovering Bitcoin. And my father, fortunately, as when he passed away in 2022, was protected by Bitcoin because he lost all of his pension in the proof of weapons network from the Ponzi scheme that blew up in the 2001 dot-com boom and bust. But the other time Japan did this was 2008, when Japan tries to raise rates and ends up back at 0% anyway, because it breaks things and breaks banking. And then we as taxpayers, of course, have to pay to keep the banks alive. And then they get massive bonuses. And then the Federal Reserve creates quantitative easing, creates more inflation, creates more homelessness, creates more wealth inequality, until eventually no one will lend to the US government other than the American people, because Japan's unwinding their trade, China's de-dollarizing, UK is broke. And so you end up with stable coins like Tether being the lender of last resort. and those that get to borrow at 0% from the central bank so that they can lend at 30% to the broke people that can't afford their mortgages anymore and need to buy it on credit card and pay 30% in order to roll over their debt into a credit card crisis, a real estate mortgage crisis. And then we saw in 2008 what happens when this leads to a credit crisis. The government steps in and all those assets end up on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. And then that becomes the collateral that backs that 6% dividend. And eventually it becomes a central bank digital currency or an unwinding of the scheme, which creates a depression and a recession when anyone tries to do it. We saw Liz Truss tried to do this in the UK. They tried to say, we're going to lower taxes, we're going to have more free markets, and it broke the UK pension scheme. She got expelled immediately and replaced by Rishi Sunak, or was it Boris Johnson, or was it Keir Starmer, or was it those entities that are all controlled by the lobby groups in order to implement those policies of war that are coming from Israel, as we will understand in the geopolitical section as well. And so Bitcoin was the only market that was open. So we got to see that. We got a massive amount of liquidations from all those idiots that were sharing, that were exchanging their real Bitcoin for paper Bitcoin in order to use leverage at exchanges. They all got liquidated, as I covered in the Bitcoin section. And this created the perfect storm for Black Monday. Why? Because the Fed announced the prior week that is not going to reduce rates. And so the market is spooked. On Friday, we had non-farm payroll data. Unemployment is worse than expected. And we had Bitcoin saying, here's the leading market, massive liquidation. So Monday comes along, the Nikkei opened up down 25%. The Taiwan Stock Exchange, which obviously is very important for the companies involved in the semiconductor industry, which is why China wants to reunify with Taiwan, because actually all of these fighter jets, all of these drones need chips from Taiwan. All of this artificial intelligence technology, NVIDIA, all of the different industries, Microsoft, all of them, the big 7 tech companies, they need all of those chips from Taiwan. And so we create a very dangerous situation geopolitically when these escalations are happening in the Middle East, in the Cold War between Russia and America, that makes China want to reunify with Taiwan. But bring that back, we get VIX, which is essentially the fear index. I'm not going to go through that. It hit record highs at 65%, through the roof on Monday. And of course, the America market has its largest correction since 1987 on Black Monday, and we have Black Monday 2024. Oil crashes with it by about 2%. Gold crashes with it as well. And we have a gap down by about 10% on the futures markets. And we have trillions of dollars that is wiped out from the US stock market as well. Let me just press a button. I'm going to have a quick water break as we go through the macro section. So do me a favor while I take a sip of water. If you're enjoying this content and you're on YouTube, hit the like button. There's no other way other people are going to see this content. We need them to protect themselves. Repost it, share it, and make sure as many people as possible can understand the weaves of this system and protect themselves. Do that for me as I take a quick water break. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so we have this market one-day correction. Why? Because all those people that have those leverage loans, that what needed it to be 0%, because Japan is now trying to get their inflation under control, it now needs to unwind and liquidate assets in order to, and then you have the derivatives trades with the exposure, and then we don't know which companies are exposed or got the risk wrong. Hopefully it's just a few hedge funds and doesn't create systemic risk like it did in 2008 that leads to a credit crisis, but we will find out in the weeks ahead. But we think that there was approximately 75% of a $4 trillion unwound during this time. Liquidity is at all-time highs. JP Morgan comes out and says, hey, we think it's okay. And there was all sorts of fake news that were created at the time when they said there's going to be an emergency meeting from the Fed. They're going to do an emergency reduction of rates. We had to debunk it on X Spaces during the live coverage that we were doing. But there is going to be no emergency Fed rate cut as a result of that, unless we see some credit crisis like 2008. But remember now, inflation is still an issue. We got these reversal of the Japanese carry trade. They can't cut rates. So there's going to be no rate cuts. But now we know that the prediction markets is saying in September, there is a much, much higher likelihood of a rate cut. The market celebrates like crazy and says, we don't believe in free markets. Let's create more wealth inequality because I need my real estate and stock markets to go up. The chances of the Fed doing rate cuts in September increases. The market is overjoyed, roll over the Ponzi scheme, and the stock markets recover. We move back to the most likely result, which is a return to quantitative easing, the reversal of the quantitative tightening trade, and the Fed gets to put more and more assets onto its balance sheet, or we get the reversal and we all look towards the Fed. Are you going to QT? Are you going to QE? And JP Morgan comes out and says, oh, it's all okay. 75% of the carry trade is unwound. Get back to business as usual. Buy stocks, buy more real estate, borrow more money, keep the Ponzi going. So what we don't know is whether we're going to get a credit crisis as a result of that. Maybe, maybe not. But we have to watch out which hedge funds were affected. Somebody lost the money. Somebody was affected by these derivatives. Someone was on the wrong side of this trade. We just don't know who yet. We have no idea. At the same time, the US announced their credit card data. So retail individuals, they're spending like crazy because there is more and more credit cards available to them. And so credit cards in the US reaches new all-time high with $1.14 trillion that is backing up the consumerism behind the stock market increases because the banks can borrow from the Fed and lend at those higher rates, and they can be incentivized to come in at 0% interest, roll over the debt, and eventually we have to have the unwinding of the credit card trade at some time. So remember, Japan needs to increase rates to control inflation. And so the Japanese people pay through inflation in order to keep American stock market Ponzi scheme alive. And they are forced to unwind that trade and not think about those that don't have assets. And it becomes very unlikely that they will be able to increase rates in order to control inflation, which creates massive depression in Japan because of the rising wealth inequality. Remember, if you increase rates, the carry trade gets worse and everything breaks. So now the Federal Reserve, it can only put more balance sheet. It can have $10 trillion on it per year, or you can increase that. And that can only be rolled over into a CBDC if we get any credit crisis type of event. Anything can break the Ponzi. And at the same time, we have OPEC, which is the Middle Eastern side, and the Russian side that control the prices of oil, decide which side are we going to go. But OPEC says that they're going to increase, the oil and the reserves, and then says that they're not. And we have to wait upon the central bank of the Middle East, which is Saudi Arabia, to decide what happens to oil prices. Depending on which side of the geopolitics they side, they're playing bricks because they don't know what's going to happen on the BRICS corridor, but they rely on US for their defense. They need the proof of weapons network to go. And that creates that destabilizing force within the Middle East. And so that brings us squarely in the middle of the geopolitical situation. and anyone can decide to opt out, Bitcoin just recovers immediately. It had its correction because people were selling Bitcoin. It creates an opportunity for those that weren't levered up to buy more Bitcoin at below 50,000. And hopefully you are one of those people rather than being liquidated at exchanges because you don't know the powerful and you don't respect what Bitcoin is. And all of the markets recovered. We almost returned to back to where we are, bringing us into what is going to happen on the geopolitical side. We had carnage on the geopolitical side this week. So we don't know which Ponzi scheme is going to blow up first, but we had massive civil unrest within the UK. It is so sad to see that there is very deliberate forces that we are seeing in the UK right now. Why? Because people don't follow the money. They don't watch Bitcoin Hard Talk. They don't realize that England has been occupied by the Bank of England when in 1694 it negotiated a Ponzi scheme to make the government bigger and bigger and bigger so that it could obfuscate all of that debt to fund wars. And then that drives more wealth inequality, which says, why are these people on the left shafted by the system? They start to blame the wrong thing when really they're on the wrong side of debt-based slavery because they don't understand the rules of money. And the debt-based fiat currency Ponzi scheme drives you into war and drives you into debt. And so the real problem is that they are living month to month because inflation is creating a cost of living crisis. And that has been created by the Bank of England and the government. And they think that it is the far right or the far left. And you get polarization and polarization. And governments, they create crazy atrocities because they need to increase their debt and justify their existence in those Ponzi schemes. More wealth inequality creates more extremism, and then it creates civil wars and civil unrest. The reality is that there are crumbling jobs because there is so much of the UK industry focused on speculation and the banking industry. And then you've got all the interest to be factored in, which depletes the manufacturing economy. Jobs are crumbling. There is an escalation of this cost of living crisis. There is a housing crisis because the Bank of England and the banks use, rather than homes as a mechanism for living in, they use it as a tool to beat inflation. And then the wealthy use their low interest rates to buy more real estate, and no one can afford it. And then the Bank of England has a policy of choosing the rich people's real estate rather than using real estate as a tool for living. And so now no one can live. You have homelessness, which is a falling living standard. People are choosing between eating and heating. And the political elites essentially bribe the politicians to get the system exactly how they want it. And this creates more and more hostility. What do the people do? Well, they eventually uprise. You have military coup d'etats in countries that don't have the same level of government stability, and countries that have extreme stability but massive wealth inequality. What do those people do? They don't get the system. They know they've been shafted. They don't know why they're broke. They don't know why they're not on the property ladder. So they start blaming whatever they can. And then external forces come in and infiltrate people's minds with psyops, because there are forces like the central banks and like the deep state controlled by the intelligence agencies that can do operations because they control the governments as well. So in the UK, we had the atrocious, disgusting, because people are becoming psychopathic as a result of these extreme behaviors, killing of 3 girls within a city of the UK called Stockport. It was disgusting. But those that were born in Britain and those that are suffering from this have had months and months of propaganda, because there's 66 million people in the UK, and a psyop allows 30,000 illegal immigrants through, and everybody starts becoming racist, blaming each other. And so rather than saying that this was somebody born in England, a Rwandan person, if someone gets the wrong video on YouTube, they start saying it's the black people versus the white people, it's the immigrants versus the natives, whatever that is, in a nation that has become all mixed race and all sorts of stuff. And we return to extreme racism and hate crimes. And then somebody comes along that is paid for by Israel, a gentleman called Tommy Robinson, whose country, the English Defense League, that was named after the Israeli Defense League, that if you look it up on Companies House, was co-founded by forces in Israel and was a psyop operation in order to make people hate Muslims. And it turns out that the shareholders in that company are all connected to these intelligence agencies psyop exercises. He rallies up all of the British people and says that wasn't a random person. It was the Muslims. It was the Muslims. And then because we've had all of the propaganda of we're being invaded right now, if you want to destroy your country, what you do is you let some illegal immigrants in, and then you use psyop exercises in order to make people hate them. And then you create wars in many countries so that you can connect a refugee crisis. And then you open the borders so that people feel that their children are at risk. You use these atrocities in order to further a regime. And now all of a sudden, we're told that everybody needs to hate the Muslims. And we've seen this story before. We've seen operations executed by intelligence agencies to connect atrocity propaganda to make people hate each other by hijacking religious faith to make you think that these are the same thing. And then dumb people infected by inflation can't see through the weeds because they can't follow the money and they can't make tail of wind. And then they think that this is they use these different operations and everyone starts going into a civil war. And then in a defense, you start doing more and more atrocious actions. And then you have uprisings. And that's exactly what happened in the UK. You had an uprising. And most people don't know that the majority of immigrants in the UK, I'm talking about the legal immigrants that solved the demographic issue, were actually, Hindus from India, or non-religious or people from different faiths from China, or Christians and Muslims from Nigeria. But we're told that it's because of Iran that we now must fight a war. So Netanyahu comes into Congress and said, hey, it's Iran that tried to assassinate Donald Trump. And we suddenly get all of these changes, and Keir Starmer, who gets a massive chunk of funding from the Zionist entity in Israel and the Israeli government. And the Israeli government hijacks the Jewish faith in order to control all their people into thinking that this is a religious battle and saying everyone must come to Israel so that you can have population growth by scamming people into think that they're in a religious war. And so the Jewish people think that they are supporting Israel, which is a non-religious psyop that took over the Israeli government using that Zionism. And then they have all of these fake atrocity propagandas and fund infiltrations of governments and people like Tommy Robinson in order to believe that you need to create civil unrest so we can all go to war with Iran and Israel can expand NATO into the Middle East and be the sole military nuclear force so that everyone can double their expenditure and everyone can spend more and more money on the military industrial complex so they can increase their stock prices that they were using colleges in America and universities in UK in order to hide that they're invested in all these companies that's creating degeneracy in society and making people not want to have children and making people want to fight each other as they believe that they are in a fight for survival because of the proof of weapons network. And of course, you just need these operations to happen so that you can justify war. And then we realized that we were lied to, and we just ended up killing more and more children and more civilians. And then we all have investments, very deliberate investments in anti Semitism, so that everyone thinks they need to move to Israel because they hijacked the Jewish faith, and Islamophobia because intelligence agencies were supporting different groups that were extreme groups because they killed all their children in Iraq and then replaced the implanted leaders with destabilized their region and created worse forces. And then intelligence agencies use them in order to say, hey, you know, all those Muslims people, they're this group, when it plays no bearing on reality. And then suddenly you're justifying in wars in Iraq, wars in Afghanistan, destabilizing Venezuela, um, justifying a genocide within Palestine. And all of that has consequences when you have resistance movements forming because of the atrocious acts. And why is it always the children? We have one job: look after our children. And why are we using pedophilia as a weaponization, like came out in the Epstein files, in order to bribe politicians so that you can control people by getting them on videos because they're disgusting acts, or if they're not willing or they're not into that type of thing? This is all revealed in the files that were released from court. So you take pictures of politicians so you can infiltrate their governments and you can bribe them in through these lobby groups into doing the acts and driving people to war. Wake up, people. Wake up. Remember, there's a lot of money that exists outside the system that you don't know about in politics, because all of these wars allow countries to take over resources. So remember, right now, there are bases across the Middle East from America. 4,000 troops were being brought in. That's going to be US troops' lives that are at risk here. The people that think they're fighting for their country. Just like the EDL, they think they're fighting for the survival of their country. When the governments created this, because they are controlled by larger forces. Everybody needs to wake up because they didn't think about one thing. Fortunately, we're all able to speak to each other. Now, YouTube won't let me get this message out, so I rely upon you sharing it so that we can find out how we can get along and understand that these are all psychological ops. And now the latest blame that we all need to be worried about is the refugee crisis. And I covered more about that last week. And so, you know, they allow illegal migration, and then we get to blame people, and that justifies the wars and all the things that we know comes because it was the proof of weapon network. And we get to the removal of human rights because now everyone's saying, if you share a post on social media, this is happening in the UK, you can get arrested. And so by sharing some of this in the UK, people are now being arrested. And what do we have from that? Well, one of the most surveyed countries in the world that buys all its surveillance technology from Israel because they have occupation as a service through their AI-based military industrial complex and exporting their cybersecurity technology like CrowdStrike and all the other the ones that can take companies down, like we have seen at the whim. Well, now we need more surveillance, of course, and we need a digital ID. And when we got digital ID and surveillance, it's very easy that when this credit crisis comes at the end of a scheme, we can just say, hey, your bank deposit's gone, but download this app. It's got a central bank digital currency, opt into the terms and conditions, and use your digital ID in order to collect it. And then next time when we want to do a lockdown, we can have complete surveillance over everything. And that is where the technology creates us, because the central banks were occupying our countries in order to move capitalist forces over to socialism and over to complete occupation by central bank digital currency. through the technology that you need atrocity propaganda to make people know that their life is in fear. And then you can create human rights violations and the central bank digital currencies that we will see. What else does it lead? It leads to more anti money laundering laws. Oh, and coincidentally, the same year the Federal Reserve was created was the same year that we needed income tax because government gave up the profits from seigniorage and creating money and created inflation instead, where everyone needs to pay for it and they need to pay for the tax. And what does anti money laundering laws do? It allows you to get all the data you can for more tax collection. Um, and this creates is the convenient end result of all of these types of forces. You can see where it's all going. So we need to protect ourselves because we all have demographic issue because we're not having children and we have that pension crisis Ponzi scheme to solve. It's either solved through immigration or is solved through more technology, which is artificial intelligence, robotics, and then who's going to have the jobs when the robotics able to do stuff? Well, of course, your central bank digital currency will give you a universal basic income, and if you're on the wrong side of that, you'll have complete dependency upon the central bank, of course. So what else did we have this week as well? As I said, and I've covered this, I'm not going to go deep into it. When you have these internal wars, you can justify external wars. And of course, right now, because of the atrocity propaganda of Israel, they're waiting for a retaliation from Iran because they blew up the person that was in charge of negotiating the peace talks. And so there is no peace talk. And now there is going to be a joint force. If you look at last time, they blew up the person in Beirut as well. And that is a violation of Lebanon's sovereignty. And so Iran needed to react. They took about 2 weeks. They showed their strength. And then America needed to be drawn in order to defend against it. The military industrial complex benefits. But now there's going to be a multi-pronged attack from Iran, Iraq, Lebanon. And that's going to escalate all these sovereign nations into it. And then we get that Abraham alliance that Netanyahu told in Congress that you need to pay for America through more inflation and UK needs to pay for. And our politicians say we want to stand up for the rights of Palestinians, but no, we'll fund the genocide. And so we're now expecting, the reaction to that. Remember, if you've watched previous episodes, that this wasn't even the bomb that's going to, the massacre that was going to justify it. It wasn't even, they said it was Israeli people. It was actually Syrian people in the occupied Golan Heights. And Netanyahu said, you need to get revenge for Trump's assassination. And then at the same time, Tommy Robinson creates civil unrest in the UK and releases a video saying that this random person was actually a Muslim person. And this is all Iran. And now Iran are going to retaliate. And we're all going to be told that you need more and more US troops, more and more UK troops over to the Middle East. And we've had 12 warships making their way over to the Middle East, 4,000 different troops going over. And remember, these are the countries that are occupied by America that they were meant to retreat from. And now you end up with a full forced regional war, which is inevitable, predictable, and guaranteed right now. And we're going to pay for it through inflation, which is going to create a cost of living crisis. And we know what happens with oil prices. And then we all have to queue outside because petrol is too expensive for people. And they try to get their petrol before the price goes up. And we get exactly what we saw in 2022 again. So that's what we're seeing. So we saw escalation in the Middle East. Now what happens? Well, Russia suddenly says, hey, NATO expansion, America's funding and putting all of these wars that are involved in the Ukraine-Russia war. Now we need to retaliate. So Russia says, we're going to drop all of this military equipment in Iran, heavy weapons, heavy air forces. And now Iran has Russia committing to its protection. Israel now is in talks, and it made announcements. It is in talks with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Jordan, and Bahrain to make a defense strategy in the air. And then you have the competing forces in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, and now Turkey is deciding which side it's on, and Russia saying we now need to protect our interests, and you have a regional war. And then, according to Israeli media, they even say that those people will defend Israel. And that's exactly what Netanyahu told you in Congress that you need to do. No congressional vote, no input from the people, no input from the president who was sleeping during the meeting. And Netanyahu, because he gets to fund all of the lobby groups through APEC and others, gets to tell America that you're now going to have to kill American people to fund our war. As I said, that's how it all works. You can see it roll out. You can get ahead of it right now. But of course, there's only one more thing we need to cover. Let's watch the destabilization of a government or force. So there was announcements that Israel should not be surprised that Russia is arming Iran now through high-tech weapons. That was an announcement. Saudi Arabia says that the leader being assassinated that was trying to negotiate peace, that was a severe violation of Iran's sovereignty by doing it within their borders and within their country. Venezuela has now, after its destabilization, been formally invited to attend the BRICS summit. America says, by the way, this is the prime minister or president. Russia says this is the prime minister or president. And now you have these different militia groups, different destabilizing of the entire region so that they can decide who's going to control the oil. And at the same time, very coincidentally, we have the complete overthrow from student protests of the Bangladeshi government. Now, I'm not going to pretend that I have studied all of the history of Bangladesh, but I can follow the money, and I will study it a little bit further to make sure that you understand what these destabilization regimes happen. This is very similar. And if this isn't what it is, then we shall see. But please follow the money and watch out for this. But I have seen this same thing before. We saw this in the very similar when the US financially backed and used the CIA in order to back the Muslim Brotherhood, who took part in the US-engineered Arab Spring in 2011. It said we have a resistance movement from students. There is military coups. There is revolutions. The people feel like they won. And then they start supporting the US-backed leader in the regimes that already existed from when the UK had monarchies and kingdoms in the Middle East. And so this looks exactly like it when you had the US-backed Muslim Brotherhood believe that they're in a revolution. All the people join it. They shut down the internet so that Egypt can then replace the US implanted leader that then makes sure that you get the Abraham Alliance aligned with Israel, and then they can send more weapons across. This is exactly what we saw within Bangladesh. We saw the student protesters demanding that the person that is most aligned with US politics, the Grameen banker, Mohammed Yunus, overlook the implementation of a new government. So if you don't know who Mohammed Yunus is, he's got a very good reputation across Bangladesh, but he is criticized because he created the Grameen Bank, which was microfinance, but rather than using Sharia-compliant Islamic finance, it used riba-based finance. And so it started issuing very predatory loans into those that are most impoverished, but it also did a lot of good because it got these micro loans through. But that's why he gets his criticism. But he became a Nobel Prize winner. He's part of many, who the US would love to see involved, which looks very much like the Muslim Brotherhood uprising. And then you suddenly get these leaders come through. and now they formed the new government. Now, what is it about Bangladesh that America might be interested? Why would they want to fund through a covert operation? And if you haven't read it, US covert, God, Covert Regime Change is a great book on the since World War II, the 65 CIA funded regime changes just like this, so that you can understand the destabilization as well. So they run out the previous prime minister. I've got no opinion on what she is, who she is, whether she was a dictator or not. You know, it's it's your own country's struggle against it. But suddenly, what was Bangladesh's strategy? Well, there is the IMF in order to get your loan, and they implement regime changes when you take a loan. And so they make you deplete all your dollar reserves so that you have to print your own country, put you in a hyperinflationary cycle. And then the IMF restructures the loan, but says your assets are ours and your government needs to change to these people. And you need to have austerity measures so that the central bank can repay and we can take those dollars out of the system and you can create inflation. And now we own your country. So China's Belt and Road Initiative says, well, we just want corridors to fight the dollar. And so the China Belt and Road Initiative said, we would like to have these different corridors put through. And so they started issuing loans within Bangladesh, but they don't come with regime change. And so why would America want to destabilize and fund a student protest in order to do that and implant Muhammad Yunus so that they can start constructing relationships with the IMF again, rather than the Belt and Road Initiative, in order to push forward the proxy war? And I'm going to be creating a video series soon that really helps you understand this in a succinct way without all of the mumbling that I do when I go for a live show, because I have just so much that I want to make sure that you're up to date with, as every week is just piling on these different things that we need to follow. So what is it? China might have extended India. That's a problem for America. So watch out whether Muhammad Yunus capitulates to US demands and then reverses some of the Belt and Road Initiative, because India was involved in supporting Russia by circumventing sanctions, by it selling some of its cheap oil so that India can then sell it to Europe, because the financial weapons of mass destruction are no longer working. And so Bangladesh might be a part of the borders that US wants to control. And so now suddenly we have mass violence, people being killed in military coups d'etats. And then we need to see what regime comes in next. It's got all of the making of everything we've seen 100 times before, funded by the central bank, money printing, funded by the intelligence agencies that have no congressional approval because it's all illegal money that operates like a mafia, and then justified by the government that implements their policies that are bought by the money that's printed and then destabilizes regions in order to make justifications. We've seen this before. Okay, I think that's enough for this week. Remember, if you watch that video, you may be bored of hearing me with all this content, but I hope you continue to enjoy it. I look forward to a boring week where all I need to do is report on a few things and we can get back to more shorter form content. But I want to make sure that you are on the right side of all of this change. I will keep reporting on everything that's happening. We will update you on Bitcoin. We will update you on macro. We will update you on geopolitics. But I hope by now you're understanding that Bitcoin is the exit. Bitcoin defunds the proof of weapons network. Bitcoin is a resistance movement. And Bitcoin is the only way that countries can get sovereignty from covert regime changes and resistance movements against the debt-based Ponzi scheme that leads you into central bank digital currencies and the removal of sovereignty from your country, as we are seeing globally around the world. Always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. It will be death for some, atrocities for others. And unfortunately, financial freedom needs to keep you on the right side of this, because it's going to be, or I want to make sure that you're on the right side of change with peace, love, unity, fighting against our governments that are allowing these things to happen, by making sure that we have the information and we don't end up falling for hating each other. Because the worst thing you could do is resist, divide, and conquer, and realize that we're not in a religious war against each other. We don't really hate each other. The majority of us just want to survive, and Bitcoin allows you to reverse the trend so that we can do this with peace. I'll see you on simondixon.com in the Bitcoin Hard Talk free membership portal, and I will keep updating you every single week. And I will see you on the other side. Peace.
The infamous Simon Dixon, he's the leading proponent and expert and the first guy to ever speak about Bitcoin. I should have read his book. He is the Bitcoin way ahead of his time guy.
Volatility that we have seen in the cryptocurrency over the past 12 months. I mean, you're a former investment banker, a trader as well. Would you recommend investors out there to buy Bitcoin?
Well, I believe that there's a lot of untapped value.
Simon Dixon, from the co-founder, lead investment advisor to Bitcoin Capital, the co-founder of Bank to the Future, one of the most preeminent investors in blockchain Bitcoin technology of this century. Simon Dixon, tell us about what's happening here.
The best investment banker in Bitcoin. So I thought you'd be the perfect person to talk. Obviously, Bitcoin, digital currency.
His name is Simon Dixon, and he is an OG for sure.
Simon Dixon has been around for so long in the space, since 2011, and was actually at the first Bitcoin conference that ever existed, along with people like Eric Voorhees, myself, Roger Ver, and some crazy people. The stories he told were epic.
Simon's an early investor in Coinbase, in Kraken, in Bitfinex, in blockchain.com, in Robinhood, in Circle, in Ripple. I mean, it's just this rock star lineup of companies that you found and got in early.
Guest today is Mr. Simon Dixon, who's the CEO of Bank to the Future. You formerly worked as a stockbroker in the city. I used to work in the city too for many years. Sir Richard Branson has said that I like the goals of Bank to the Future, where everything is transparent and people can see what happens with their money. Welcome to London Real.
First up is Simon Dixon, a former investment banker and economist. He is also author of Bank to the Future, Protect Your Future Before Governments Go Bust. And he's also the CEO and founder of banktothefuture.com. He blames the banks for the global recession, but cautions against investing in gold.
Simon, I can see why you have a show. You said it better than I did.
This traditional financial system is a Ponzi scheme, is going to collapse, a lot of people are going to get hurt, and we need an alternative system to hedge the bet.
So always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting times in financial history. It's going to be really hard for some, great for others, and I want you to be on the right side of that change. Peace.